Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in the Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm your host, Luke Jansen.
And I'm Scott Dyer.
This podcast has always been about a long journey. We try to present it in a way that makes the journey a collective one. We and our listeners are walking down this path together. The path that conservative Christians and fundamentalists like to call the slippery slope. And they are right, it is a slippery slope. Once you stop treating Christian beliefs as unquestionable, once you start digging into even some of the most basic and foundational tenets, like the inerrancy of Scripture or the virgin birth, every question, or fairly often it's the answers to that question, just evokes several more questions.
Yeah, that's certainly been my experience as well. And the slippery slope analogy, that's certainly a very common one that you hear. Well, when you start asking questions of things, you get warned, oh, be careful, it's a slippery slope. And
What was the first question for you?
That's interesting. Probably things around creation and some of the early accounts in the Bible and how unscientific they are, things around that side of things.
Yeah, me too. It was the science, the evolution, creation, evolution.
Yeah.
But
okay.
There you go.
Yep.
For some believers, the response then is don't ask questions. Don't seek understanding. Just believe. Just accept things at face value. But for people like me, like us, and our listeners, we're not built that way. We feel a need to hold our faith with our heart and with our head. We want to be convinced of what we believe. And we feel it's okay to question God. So did Abraham. So did Job and the psalmist. Thomas and Peter. The Apostle Paul instructed Timothy to study in order to be fully convinced.
Yeah, that whole head-heart thing, that's exactly the same kind of experience. People would say, well, you're too heady, your faith is too much in your head as opposed to you got to believe with your heart and so on. And I'm not even sure what that means.
Exactly.
When you really start to dig into that, it falls apart pretty quickly. And it was not a very satisfying approach for me, and I know for you, and for many others. It's interesting. In conversations in recent days with my own father, who is now 96 and still ponders. Yeah, he's doing pretty well. I mean, it's, he's 96, but...
That bodes well for you, Scott.
Yeah, well, we'll see. He complains about things, and I sometimes, and I think, oh man, I already feel some of those things already, and he's 30 years older. But anyhow, he said to me recently, he said, I have a scientific mindset. I just can't set that aside. And I said, well, that's fine. You don't have to. But in the little town he was born and raised in, that was the prevailing, when he went to church, it was hellfire and brimstone. And, that's his experience of how the church deals with things. And he rejected that.
I've been there, done that.
Yeah.
So we're on this journey down the slippery slope, rejecting ideas and dogma that we previously thought were essential, but now realize are non-essential. For me, like the virgin birth, or not defensible anymore, like inerrancy of Scripture. And finding new pathways to give us a new perspective and understanding, a new way to hold a Christian faith, like seeing Scripture as fully human and divinely inspired, and the universe and life and consciousness and humans emerging out of a set of fundamental physical constants. And in this new season of episodes, season number 7, we're going to be bringing on quite a few authors and their latest books about their own journeys and the new paths that they've found. The podcast will be less of a critique of old ideas and old pathways and more on offering new ones, we hope. So send us your recommendations. Now, as for today's episode, it comes from a book review, one that was actually somewhat negative about the book we're going to hold up for our audience. I'm a member of a group, the American Scientific Affiliation, which has been around for a while now. It's getting within sight of its first centennial. It was founded in 1941. It's a potpourri of theologians and scientists, young earth and old earth creationists, fundamentalists, evangelicals, liberal Christians, so a very diverse mixture of views and ideas. So it is a valuable resource, but it can be frustrating at times. Now, in that journal, they regularly feature reviews of recently released books. And here's the opening paragraph of one such book review that was printed just a couple months ago. So this is what I read. Protestants for whom neither atheism nor fundamentalism is an option face a declining menu of choices. On the American scene, there was a time when evangelicalism claimed a spot on that menu. However, its generation-long alignment with reactionary politics has rendered it unattractive for some Protestants. For the latter, the only thing left is some species of liberal theology. This book is one such species. It is for people who want to believe in God, but who can no longer believe that God rules providentially and intercedes miraculously. It is, in short, for many Christians who take the results of the sciences with the utmost seriousness. And as I read that, I thought, that's me. This book is for me. What this book reviewer was saying is exactly me. That paragraph perfectly describes where I'm at now on that slippery slope.
Yeah, I would concur that it pretty much describes myself as well. You and I have talked about this before. I don't know if we've talked about it on the show, but sometimes it feels like you're kind of in this post-apocalyptic kind of, like you've gone through this deconstruction phase where you've kind of blown a lot of things up and you're among these ruins, but you're still looking for, is there something among the ruins here
Right.
that is still worth hanging on to, and,
Right.
or is there something among the ruins where I can rebuild something out of this
Right.
that's still satisfying? That certainly, I think, describes myself as well, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners.
I think you're remembering, I mean, it has come up many times, but I think the first one that comes to my mind is Peter Enns.
Yeah.
When we were talking with him.
Yes.
Now, the review was a little bit critical about this book. Not because of anything about the quality of the writing or the quality of the argument. I think, if you ask me, it was more because that the writer of that review did not like where the book was taking them. They didn't like it. I was open to the idea that I felt I needed to look into this book. We have had guests on this show who are young earth creationists, other guests who are agnostics and atheists, some who are even staunchly anti-Christian. So I'm willing to talk to anybody, really, to get a different perspective. So having someone come on who may get us asking some hard questions and grappling with difficult issues and offering answers to both, I say bring it on.
Yeah, amen.
I checked out the credentials of the author, Dr. Philip Clayton, and I was thoroughly impressed. He got a joint PhD at Yale University in the philosophy of science and philosophy of religion. He's helped organize research groups and conferences on religion, science, and theology at the Vatican, the British Council, Harvard University, and other such conferences pertaining to climate change at University of California, Berkeley, at COP26, at the UN Global Climate Summit in Glasgow in 2021. So he's a guy who's really commanding the attention of some very learned and important people. He received a Fulbright Fellowship, an Alexander Van Humboldt Professorship, and the Templeton Research Prize and Templeton Book Prize, among many other honors. And he's taught at or held research professorships at Williams College, at California State University, Harvard University, Cambridge University, the University of Munich, and now the Claremont School of Theology, where he holds the Ingraham Chair. And we have him right here now in our virtual studio. Dr. Philip Clayton, welcome to our podcast.
Welcome.
Thanks, you guys. Great to be here.
Looking forward to this discussion. It's a topic close to my heart, and I know to Luke's as well. So it'd be great to hear from your vast experience.
Well, from the number of episodes I've listened to, I know that I'm in for a ride.
Okay, so Philip, you've taught and written for several decades on the relations between science and religion. You've written and edited 25 books in that area in general, and more recently in ecology in particular. What drew you into this area?
So I came to Christianity out of a strongly atheist family. My dad was a professor who did his work on atheism and George Bernard Shaw and so forth. And so my teenage rebellion at 14 was to come home from an evangelical camp, Mount Hermon, and saying, I found Jesus. And unfortunately, you guys are going to hell. And so my dad had gone to Stanford. I was applying to Stanford. I dropped that application and went to Westmont College in Santa Barbara, California, which in those days was very conservative. It had a dictation view of scripture.
Oh, wow.
So every word is literally spoken by God. And I was trying to figure out, okay, I've got this faith. I'm a philosophy major, so I'm trying to get reason. How do I bring them together? And three of us wrote our senior theses. The most brilliant of us left college and didn't go on to academics. Kevin Van Hooser wrote one on faith and reason, famous evangelical theologian,
Hmm.
and I wrote on faith and reason and science. And it's been a lot of decades since that time, but the themes have been central to my emerging faith and my understanding of what do I know, what am I guessing at, where am I grasping at straws?
Hmm.
And ecology is a fairly new angle in your trajectory, your interest.
I inherited it from my mother, who was an activist, and being an outdoor person on the West Coast. But as it became clear that, well, actually, I know the very moment. It was 2008. I was at Claremont School of Theology. The famous John Cobb was speaking in a lecture on the future of faith. And he said, skipping all the details, this thing is serious. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people will die. And I was so shocked that it hadn't really sunk in. And I interrupted the lecture and said, "No, John, you don't, is that really right?" And then he said, "No, probably hundreds of millions, if not
Mm.
billions of people will die." And I
Wow.
walked out into the darkness and thought, as a Christian, there's nothing more important for me than to do what I can. So I launched an international environmental nonprofit, ecociv.org, ran that for 10 years. And as you guys know, I've been writing in that area as well.
Yeah,
Like my friend Brian McLaren, who also
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah,
takes it seriously.
right. I've got on my notes here that you, the United Nations Global Climate Summit, you did a number of panels there. You moderated panels at COP26.
Yeah, I've been very active writing and speaking and traveling. We've just finished, we did a symposium at Harvard with the Center for the Environment with 12 scientists from around the world, and that's just forthcoming from Routledge now under the title Climate Change, What Must Be Done. The endorsement from Bill McKibben came in today, so we're all super
Ah.
positive.
Okay. Well, we brought you in to talk about, I believe this is your latest book, Science and the Sacred, Beyond the Gods in Our Image. And maybe before we dive into the book itself, I think it's important for the audience to hear about your co-author, because it's the pairing of you two coming from two
Yes.
very different worldviews. That's really the strength and the importance of this book. So tell us about Claudia.
Yeah, and there's a development in the doing of the book that makes it even more important to mention Claudia. We'd been discussion partners since we worked together to launch an interreligious university where Jews, Christians, and Muslim future imams, rabbis, pastors would come together, sit in the same classroom to desegregate religious education was the word. And I was the provost and she was the head of publicity for this project. We got to know each other. We began a series of discussions that lasted over 3, 4, 5 years, together with a third individual whom I'll mention later. At one point, Claudia said, "Let's do a book. Most of your books aren't broadly accessible. I'm a journalist. She was a great journalist, actually. Let's make this really readable. And let's play off the differences. You're a theist. I'm not a theist. I'm a humanist. And yet we often feel like we share a lot in common." So we began the writing process. And about a year before the book was published, Claudia called me up and said, "Philip, I have some really bad news. I just heard that I have brain cancer
Oh.
and I'm only expected to have a year to live." And that brought such a poignancy, a reality to questions like, does she believe in an afterlife of any sort? Are these values really the values she could live and die by?
Mm.
So we had some intense conversations at the end, and Claudia did pass actually before the book was published.
Wow.
So her voice, I'm really glad that we helped to get her voice out there in a constructive dialogue with a theist, which doesn't happen that often.
Right.
No.
Yeah, you said in one of your interviews, I heard you say that she really pushed back hard on some of your arguments in ways that you had
Oh,
not
yeah.
anticipated.
Absolutely. You know how journalists are, they're really friendly. They invite you in, and then all of a sudden you realize it's like a mousetrap.
Yeah.
And when I had, excuse the theological term, bullshit arguments, she was right there to chop them down. The third individual in this 5-year discussion group was Damon Gedry, a former Roman Catholic. Claudia was a very conservative evangelical for many years of her life before moving in this direction. So a lot of the nuances that I hope will come out in our conversation come from, yeah, the probing, deep, smart criticism that they brought to me as a theist.
So, Phil, let's talk a bit about the approach that you and Claudia took to this project. I personally like it how you make it clear that you're targeting people who put quite a heavy emphasis on what science has to say about the big questions in life. So right off the bat, you're setting aside all those arguments that begin with the words, but the Bible says, or like Augustine said. And so your search for truth in this book begins with what science has to say. You're singing my song, Philip.
I know, I was just having that thought that your guests have been people, whether from the more conservative or more liberal side, who aren't afraid of the dialogue and who don't think it's something we can leave behind with a quick statement or Bible verse or something. I think a lot of your guests are living the struggle, as I have the sense that you guys as hosts do as well. And that's the audience that we invite into this book. They may be now always will be evangelical. They may be and always will be atheist. Greg Epstein, for example, wrote one of the publicity blurbs. He's the humanist chaplain at Harvard University and famous. But all of them feel like the discussion itself matters. It contributes to our own self-understanding, and it's something, frankly, that the world needs faced with what can I say, the greatest crisis that humanity has faced in the history of its species. If we don't bring all of our moral and ethical and I'm going to say religious and spiritual resources together, we're not going to make it.
Right. So you, Philip, you come at these questions from the theist point of view in contrast to Claudia's, I'll call her atheist, her humanist point of view. But maybe you could say a few words about your theism, your Christianity. I know that you embrace open or process theology, and we talked a couple of years ago with Dr. Thomas J. Ord. That would be episode 90. He gave us the quick 101 on what open theology and process theology are all about. So you don't have to really get into the details there, but maybe you can say why you've embraced that expression of Christian faith and how it informs you on these questions we're going to talk about today.
It's an intellectual question, but it's for me a deeply personal question. If I had to boil it down to two reasons, I would say that if we have an all-controlling God, then God is responsible for everything that happens. Right to that point that Calvin mentions in the Institutes, for God predetermined every person, some to eternal damnation and some to eternal salvation, and that this was nothing with what they would or ever did do. The decision was 100% God's. And it was actually working with my co-author, Steve Knapp. Do you remember around Christmas time, 2003 was when the tsunami went from Indonesia to Thailand. There were 350,000 people killed on the beaches and wherever the water could reach. And we thought, if God could work a miracle, it would be so easy just to put into people's minds, run. I mean, it doesn't have to be too supernatural, just get that word out. That didn't happen. God is responsible, if God is all powerful, for everything that happens. And that makes the problem of evil insoluble for me. And that was the thing that started me on the movement toward open theism or open and relational theism. The other one is the deprecation of science from that view, but we'll probably get to that later on.
No, it's very interesting. Calvin is nothing if not logical, right? Like
Absolutely.
people rail against his double predestinarianism, but he's kind of being honest and logical. Like if you believe this, then what other conclusion can you come to, right?
Scott, that's perfect because what the service Calvin did is to work out the logic of an all-controlling, or rather all-determining God.
Right.
I did my theology under Pannenberg for 4 years in
Yeah.
Munich, Germany. And Pannenberg also used that phrase, all-determining God, alles bestimmende Wirklichkeit in German. But he said the influence comes from the future, which means we live in a world where it's not yet known. So I thought this was the one I wanted, and he was a great mentor and brutally challenging in what he expected. But my first article was beginning to push back on Pannenberg because he said that the entire future is determined. It's just that we don't know it. And I thought, well, then isn't God still responsible for everything if God is determining everything. So I found my movement to open and relational theism was one step beyond that. And you know where it started with the beginning of the discussion of open theism. It went back to, well, there was a meeting in 1998 where John Cobb invited all the open theists of the day, most of whom later were close friends and colleagues of mine, Clark Pinnock in particular, Craig
Mm,
Boyd, John Sanders, Bill Hasker, Richard Rice, who was just down the street in Riverside, and and tried to find common ground between process theology, which we might get to later, and open and relational. And the only difference from Calvin, I'm pushing it a little bit, for the open theist was God doesn't exhaustively know the future. God doesn't know future free decisions of human beings. So if next Saturday you're choosing either chocolate or vanilla ice cream, God doesn't know what you'll choose if it's a genuinely free decision. It's
right.
called middle knowledge in the Middle Ages. And that was the beginning, or my evangelical friends might say, the slippery slope for Phil Clayton, because I thought that's right. God wouldn't know that. And once you do that, then you move, I think, into a beautiful form of, for me, spirituality of living with God in an open universe, but also a theology of an open and relational theism.
Yeah, it's interesting. Clark Pinnock, I read most of his works and got to meet him. Um,
Oh, good.
yeah, yeah, he was a very nice man. And but the thing that seemed to really convince him or whatever is just, these verses in the Bible itself, where God seems so genuinely surprised,
Yeah.
and so genuinely frustrated. And of course, theologians have written those things off as anthropomorphisms, but why? Like
Hmm.
there's no particular reason except the fact that we don't want to think that God could change his mind or that God could be surprised. And but so it sounds like for you, it's been a similar kind of realization.
Yes, that's exactly right. And the Jesus story takes on a very different flavor if it's all determined. So Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane in Luke 22, Lord, if it be thy will, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done, is not a human being faced with his own death and pain and knowing what's coming and feeling fear and really reaching out to God. Instead, it is Christus Victor, as the famous book by
Mm.
Allen says, namely the one who knew completely all things at all times and knew that in a few hours he'd be sitting at the right hand of the Father. If remember the Hebrews passage, Jesus is tempted in every way as we are, yet without sin. But if he knows with absolute certainty everything that's going to happen, he's not tempted in every way as we are. And that,
That's
to
right.
me, the loss of a Jesus who we could relate to in that human way is one of the great losses of a determinism in theology.
Yeah, he's really, I mean, as much as the doctrine of incarnation is so central to Christianity, we in a sense don't believe in it because, in a sense, right? We don't, most people don't believe Jesus was really human. Because
Hmm.
certainly not in the way that we're human, because we're very limited.
Yeah,
We struggle, we doubt, and most people are not comfortable with a Jesus that is that fully human.
yeah, well said. And this, not only is it this great divide between a kind of deterministic theology of predestination, all the forms of Calvinism, and open theists, but it is a much more subtle line that runs down the middle of a lot of theology works. Keith Ward is a great theologian, was Regis Chair at Oxford and a personal friend. And I remember in his book about the Trinity, he said that God had chosen Jesus and it was determined that Jesus would be the one who died on the cross from before his birth, kind of like Calvin's before the foundation of the world. And so my co-author and I asked Keith, well, so what if Jesus got, a virus as a 2-year-old? After all, about 50% of births didn't make it to the age of 18. The mortality rate for infant mortality was very high in those days. What would God have done? And Keith said, well, God would have worked a miracle to keep him alive. And we said, and what if he were, just unfortunately a whole bunch of stuff went wrong? a saw drop, cut his hand off and so forth. And Keith said everything God would, because God had already decided God would do whatever it took. And that's that picture of Jesus' life it gives me pause.
Yeah. It's interesting. I have a good friend who's evangelical but he's a game designer.
Oh,
He creates both mostly computer games. And so we've talked a lot about games and game theory and things like that. And he said, I've thought a lot about how you can make a game from a Christian perspective. This is particularly his Christian perspective as a Calvinist. And he said, I don't know how you could do it because everything's sorted out. Everything's, already,
oh, okay.
it's not really a game because a game has to have an undetermined ending. Otherwise, it's not really a game. And I just think that's interesting, so he
And
sees that issue.
and
Yeah,
Scott,
go
don't we
ahead.
want to say the game of life is similar?
Right.
It's got an
Exactly.
undetermined ending,
Right.
which means my struggle to live with God, to live a life that's not selfish but open to the divine, is a real struggle and is determining where my, 65 or whatever years we get goes.
Right.
And I think God's an incredible support, but it would be like having a father who had determined every step of my life. At the human realm, it doesn't work, and the Holy Father wouldn't be as close somehow if it weren't the divine presence in the warp and woof of life, in the pain and the struggles and the doubts. And I mean, I find God in those places just as a paraclete, as the one who comes alongside with compassion.
Okay, gentlemen, I want to dive into the book now, but one thing that I did catch my eye, I wanted to ask you about the subtitle to your book. Why the reference to Gods in our image, especially given that Claudia is a secular humanist?
Right. And Claudia really pushed for that subtitle.
Huh,
I think a lot of people have said they find it a little confusing, but in her view, all the gods that we create are created in our image. I had to admit that there are projections that I bring that, an Eskimo or an indigenous person wouldn't bring to Christianity. But I let it stand. I mean, she wants us actually, probably in ways, to be honest, that make me a little uncomfortable to have to say, well, everything we say about God is a projection of ourselves.
right.
I think I want to say that we know or intuit something about God. There's a lot to say on that topic. But
Okay.
pure projection, Luke, that's kind of what the subtitle hints at.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so you both divided the book into two parts. Let's talk about the first part of that. You and Claudia looked at what we know about cosmology and astrophysics, about biology and evolution, and about neuroscience. You as a theist and Claudia as an atheist, secular humanist, and you found you both could fully embrace those perspectives of reality, and only some small disagreement as to where it points. So tell us a bit about that.
Yeah. So the areas where we agreed were probably three. The interpretation of the science. So uh, not only, what do the equations say, but how do we as non-scientists take that on board? Then we found that in areas of values, the things we live for that are most important, addressing the climate crisis, for example, 100% agreement. And also, thirdly, this is harder, is that religions often have an early phase where they have beliefs and ways of being that aren't 100% a fit for, early 21st century. And that was an area where we agreed. I suppose it's easier for her as not affiliated with any religion to say that. It's hard for me as a Christian well, I listened to your podcast on the Exodus and all the difficulties of taking that, historically and scientifically. That, okay, that's fine. But there is a certain loss for us when we have to view a lot of our heritage as a Christian, Jew, or Muslim from as projection or fiction and so forth. More painful for me, but I have to say, a lot of it just can't be the way I learned in fourth grade,
Right.
to quote you, Luke, from that podcast.
Okay. I do want to talk for a few minutes about where you and Claudia disagreed on where the data pointed, the implications of the findings, because you'll see in a moment, I'm going to say in one case, I'm on your side, Phil, and then in the other case, I'm on Claudia's. So you looked at cosmology and astrophysics. Again, a theist and atheist, you can both embrace Big Bang cosmology, perhaps even that the universe looks fine-tuned. I've got that in air quotes. Our listeners can go back to our episodes, quite a few that we did, 164 to 167, if they want to know what this issue of fine-tuning is all about. So you
had some great guests, by the way. I was listening to those.
Now, there's several of them. You and Claudia are standing side by side on almost everything here. The disagreement only comes up in seeing that finely tuned universe as either a great cosmic accident versus the product of a fine-tuner.
Yeah. So the three main areas of science we looked at were fundamental physics, especially cosmology, evolution and evolutionary theory, so biology, and neuroscience, so brain and consciousness. And then we got into the nature of religion and values and so forth in the later part. And if I tried to say in a single word what that difference was that emerged, as you correctly note, Luke, rather firmly, it's the nature of the emergence in each case. So emergence is when something new comes out of the laws, what came before. And the philosophers say, well, there's a kind of strong emergence where something new comes to be that didn't exist before. And then there's a much more physicalist approach where they say it's a weak emergence, new patterns emerge, new appearances emerge, new dynamics emerge, but still the fundamental constituents of all things are matter and motion, quantum physics, or the four fundamental laws, the four fundamental forces of the universe. And that came up over and over again. So in fine-tuning, which is a word that's used without blushing in physics, I would see it as at least consistent with a creator God. And Claudia would see it as just a feature of this universe. In biology, I think the emergence of different kind of subjects and their subjectivity. Bonobos have a theory of other minds. They can imagine what another bonobo must be thinking. The parallels with the great apes and us are amazing. And so I see this as the emergence of something like the consciousness, the being in the world that humans have. Nope, for Claudia, it's a beautiful pattern of complexity that biology is all about, but don't go drawing metaphysical conclusions, she would say. And then in the brain and mind debate, I do think that consciousness is a real existent in the universe. Claudia was much more cautious about moving beyond the physical or neurological parameters.
Okay, so you summarize what you and Claudia found, and this concept of emergence is very important. I think someday we're going to have to do an episode on that, Scott. But I might be reading in my own thoughts as you were recounting there, Philip, because I was getting at the idea that the data points towards a personified being. And so in cosmology and astrophysics, this idea of a fine-tuned universe, it could look like there's a tuner that tuned the universe, or it's a complete accident. I get that. And so in that sense, I'm on your side. But then when you talk about biology and evolution, some people would say, well, now the evidence points towards design, an intelligent designer. And Scott and I did quite a few episodes on intelligent design,
Yes,
numbers
you did.
130 to 142. And I find myself completely unable to go down that path anymore. So the irony, the paradox that I struggle with is I can accept fine-tuning in cosmology, but not intelligent design in biology.
I think that's really interesting. And there are some good science reasons on your side. We just don't know why the universe would have the structure that it has that would make it more likely that intelligent life would emerge in the end, that it would take on these features. And as you well know and covered in your previous episodes, if there are many universes, multiverse theory, then that doesn't point at all toward God. If there's only one universe and it seems set up for the emergence of complexity of life, of conscious life, then we think it's surely plausible to have a metaphysical, theological explanation for it. So am I capturing your intuition right there, Luke?
Well, actually, Mostly, but not quite, because I was quite on board with the whole concept of fine tuning, that the constants are just such that to have not only the appearance of all this matter, particles coming into existence, but that from that came life. And I can see
Yes.
how the constants could be set up so that we would get that. The constants that not only produce hydrogen and helium, but they also produce carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus, etc. So yes, the emergence of life, I can get on board with the idea that it was tuned to produce life. But intelligent design, where people talk about how this gene is completely designed by somebody so that it would do this function, and we did some episodes looking at this concept of intelligent design and the reasons why I can't accept intelligent design anymore. So when I frame the question from a biological point of view, I say I can't buy into an intelligent designer. But if I frame it in a cosmological, astrophysical context, yeah, I get the idea of a tuner, and I get that.
Oh, that's interesting. So for you, the difference in two metaphors, a tuner and a designer, it's a little bit more like Calvin's God. Everything's been designed in a very precise way to
Right.
produce these outcomes. Is that
Yeah.
it?
Yes.
Hmm.
Yeah. So I mean, now we are resurrecting some of the points I made in those episodes. But for example, there's a lot of examples of design where it works wonderfully, but no designer would have done it that way. So, for example, for me to hammer a nail into a pipe in the basement so that it can be a coat hanger, and there's a little bit of dribbling, and over time, the rust will seal up the hole so it doesn't leak anymore. So now you got a nail in the drain pipe that holds a coat. It works perfectly fine, but no designer would design it that way. And yet, that's what we see in the body, in the human body. There's all kinds of designs that are just really clunky designs.
Yeah. So
So
go ahead, Scott.
I was just saying, so Luke, it's kind of from what I gather, the tuning gets things started, but once things have started, all the rest of it is basically,
Hmm.
I guess random chance over time.
So you're calling me a deist?
Well, kind of. Whatever. I mean, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, sure, if the shoe fits, wear it. No, I'm just kidding.
Well,
So for me, the intelligent design that claims to be science or better than existing science, that dimension of ID was this place where I exited the bus. It just Behe's response when data started coming in showing that the particular structure that he said had to be designed by God, might have been hemoglobin or something. The scientists went and a dozen papers were written after his book, 98 or something, was published showing that how this actually could have evolved. So it's that claim for scientific status that got a lot of attention.
Mm,
But the nuance I would bring to our discussion is a little bit different. If evolution is evolving more and more complex forms of life, are these a sign that that emergence will continue to you remember for an open theist, it's not going to be deterministic in design, like actually building the stuff. It's going to be a lure or a draw toward possibility. It's going to be God making it likely that, or more likely that something would happen, but never determining the outcome.
mm.
And what happens is there's a theistic argument, and this is where I'm really interested whether you guys support it or not. This is where Claudia said no, and I was open to it, that the increasing complexity across biology, even if you add some sort of vague lure toward complexity or creativity from a divine, I mean, just to keep it really gentle and consistent with natural law, okay? But then a lot of weird and unexpected stuff happens in the evolution of life on this planet over the, millions and millions, actually billions now, we think, of
hmm
years. And then you get a human being so you get a being that's conscious of itself, that has the notion of God. Now, does that show that God has been drawing the whole thing, even if in ways consistent with the natural science, to the point where God becomes manifest sort of at the end of the process as an influence, the source, and maybe the telos of the whole thing? Claudia
Mm,
said, no, you can't go there. And I
mm.
thought, well, maybe. So
Yeah,
where do you guys come down on that?
I tend to think in that same direction. To me, if we believe that there's some sort of God who wanted to create something outside of himself or herself, outside of themselves, that they could bestow their loving nature on. It seems to me that it would have to kind of be this way. They would have to be very free and very surprising even to that God, right? And probably very painful as well, because there
Yeah.
would be missteps and there would be, and to me it addresses to some extent at least the problem of evil, because
Yeah.
no, God's not creating the evil. To me, a lot of it comes back to true what would be true freedom.
Mm.
And you can't love anything, to me, if you don't love it in freedom, then it's not really love. And so if we do think that love is at the very heart of everything, then to me this is consistent. This kind of makes sense that you'd have this kind of universe. I know that I think it's Stegner, the atheist. Is that his? Who is an atheist writer? I might be getting the name wrong, but basically his argument for atheism was, well, if you look at the actual universe we have, what does that speak to? Like, what does that kind of point us to? In his opinion, it pointed us to just no God at all. But you could flip that around, I think, and also say, well, maybe it points to the exact, opposite of that. Maybe this is how a truly loving God would, in fact, create free and loving, that he could, so that there would be an other. Like the issue
Mm.
of the other, to me, that's a fascinating question. How could God create an other? How could there be
Mm.
something other than God? How could there be? Right?
Yeah.
Like people,
Yeah.
I don't think people think about that too often, but I think that's a real fundamental question. And it kind of brings up some of these things.
Yeah,
Anyhow,
so I'm really close to that position as you've just described it, Scott. I think you're thinking of Jeremy Shermer, who was the
yes,
editor of Skeptic magazine,
yes,
and we've
Michael
done
Shermer.
debates and things.
Michael
And he,
Shermer, yeah.
yes, he takes exactly the position. But I'm trying to read your body language, Luke, whether that's something you agree with or you're.
I can accept the idea that there is a creative, I use the term creative life force, not
Yeah.
to impersonify God, but because I think that the name God, just because of my background, my Christian upbringing, and I think of most of the people around me, it means something very different. So,
Yeah,
to
yeah.
answer your question, I'm quite on board with the idea of a creative life force, which can include consciousness, can include a lot of other characteristics that, as you use the word lure, and I know that's from open and process theology, it draws things in a certain direction, tries to tilt the balances in favor of those things happening, and I'm in favor of that. But the concept of an intelligent designer where tinkering around with the genes and introducing new genetic information at the gene level, like directly intervening on that level,
Yeah.
I can't buy that, because there's just so
So
many examples of clunky design. Go ahead.
So that's where this conversation has led is really helpful. It gets to the clarity. The resistance to intelligent design is not that God might be luring all things toward God's self or being a spirit of compassion and creativity and love in the world, the way Scott described it. The difficulty is that intelligent design as a thesis is anti-scientific. It's not compatible with the way we actually understand cosmology and the evolution of life. And so one has to create a battle between faith and reason, between theism and science. And that's what Claudia and I were trying to say. We don't have to go there.
Right.
Some theists want to, some scientists want to say theism is baloney and should be ignored. But there are spaces where we can walk the path at least a long way. And God knows in the division of our society, to be able to even get that far would be significant.
Right.
Mm. It also strikes me, intelligent design, it just brings back the God of the gaps, where they're looking for
Mm.
some gap in evolution, or maybe many, that can't be explained by science. Therefore, it's God.
Yeah.
To me, it just goes right back to that. That's just such a constant temptation for a certain type of Christian apologist.
Yeah.
So some of the things that we're talking about now bring us to the second half of your book, part 2, where you and Claudia, again, a theist and an atheist, you directly challenge some religious notions that we've inherited from the distant past. I'm just going to listen very quickly, such as the very notion of God, his omniscience, omnipotence, and omnipresence, scripture, eschaton, miracles, and the afterlife. So let's talk about that. But let's first talk about this concept of God that we've been actually talking about for the past 10 minutes. How did you and Claudia unpack that new conception of God?
hmm So remember, we're at the Center for Process Studies, the mecca of process theology in the world.
Mhm.
And John Cobb and David Ray Griffin and Catherine Keller and all these doctoral students of John Cobb's over 50 years are coming to meetings. And I'm here as a co-director of the center, but not really a Whiteheadian, more an open theist, as critics kept saying of my books. And so in that world, the question was, how can we, so Claudia and me and our third discussion partner, Damien, how can we see our way through all these traditional understandings of religion, which sometimes clash with science and sometimes clash with morality,
Right.
like the problem of evil or determinism or dualism, that we are a spirit and a body, pneuma and sarx, right, in New Testament language. And we wanted to see how close could we get to agreement without actually being identical. I remained a theist, she remained an atheist. But what is exciting about the book, and maybe you're sensing, Luke, some of the tensions, is we tried to bring our positions as close as possible. They never joined, but you could definitely see that we're much closer than a lot of our friends are on political issues or,
Mhm.
ethical issues or, other environmental questions. An atheist and a theist can be active in the world for many of the same causes, live for many of the same values, appreciate a spirituality of nature, of other things. I, in the end, continue to see it as God breathed, as one philosopher said. And Claudia sees it as not having a personal or not less than personal being at the core. Omnipresent God was not offensive to Claudia, and it isn't to many atheists. The divine spirit would somehow be present everywhere. I mean, we see that in nature spirituality, though they might not use the word divine spirit. We see it in indigenous traditions. We see it even in the Romantic poet William Wordsworth in a
Mm.
poem called Tintern Abbey, who, not writing as a theist, says, speaks of, quote, a sense divine of something far more deeply interfused.
Mm.
Beautiful phrase. Whose
Mm.
dwelling place is the blue ocean and the round air and in the mind of man. So that kind of omnipresence is a lot more common ground than you might think.
Mm.
That some of the horrid things that religions, including Christianity and Judaism, have done in the past and are captured in our scriptures, a lot of agreement. I don't think that Christians always got it right.
Right.
Um, could talk more
Mhm.
about that. Miracles. So I'm a little, and maybe this will disturb your listeners, but I am hesitant to speak of physical miracles. It's really hard to make sense of science if at any moment God can step in, set aside the natural laws, and do something different. I believe in divine action as lure, as presence, as comfort, but that's not the same as finding a place where we say, oh, this is God's finger. God did this right here that came from outside the entire realm of nature. Let me
Mm.
pause there.
I'm just curious. So on the issue of miracle, and I have the same issues that you've voiced. Now there are some more nuanced views of miracle that it's not so much a violation of natural order, but more reworking of it and so on. But if you here's kind of a question. If you subtract miracle from the biblical corpus and particularly the New Testament, so the healings of Jesus and things like that, and of course in particular the resurrection, what's left then?
So, my view is not that we take away the agency of God, but only that we don't affirm that something happened that just simply breaks the laws of nature.
Right.
So that Jesus would be, spiritually speaking, the firstborn of all creation, as Paul writes, one can affirm that Jesus would have, in that sense, a unique relationship with God, that the Spirit of Christ would be present at all times, that God would be present as compassion, or oh man, so many stories. Be present as lure to the good, that God would strengthen our wills. None of that uses physics causal language.
Mm.
And I believe that so much the of the New Testament in particular continues to be present and viable with that clause. Now, I believe in the resurrection. There's a debate among New Testament scholars whether the resurrection had to be a physical resuscitation of the body or could be a spiritual resurrection. This is what you get from maybe John 14, when, I go, but I will send my spirit. So we speak of the Spirit of Christ or the Holy Spirit. And I actually think that the Spirit took on a Christological form after Jesus' death and resurrection, that the Spirit presences Christ to the world wherever the Spirit of God is present. That's a pretty high Trinitarian theology,
Yeah.
just without saying that the patterns that we study in science can be broken at any moment. As C.S. Lewis says in one place, that all across the world, God enters through little orifices in order to work his will on her nature's patterns. And that is not my understanding of the God of Jesus Christ.
Mm.
But
So that's Scott's take on your question about the miracles. Because I have had a chance to think a bit more about that. So at one point, I think, Philip, you talked about God having to set aside the laws of nature and perform a miracle. And I'm saying maybe it's not that he sets aside the laws of nature, but it has a much greater understanding of the laws of nature. I forget who it is who has talked about how the things that we do today, we humans do today, would appear miraculous to people, 5,000 years ago. So, for example, we can make a chunk of metal float. How much does a battleship weigh? Like tons, and we make it float. We can make humans fly. Those guys that put on those wingsuits and jump off of Mount Everest, and they fly because they understand the laws of aerodynamics. We talk about raising people from the dead. We do a lot of that today. People are brought back from the dead with CPR, with electroshocks to the heart, where in the past those people would have been long dead. We can now bring them back in many cases. Obviously not in the vast majority of the cases we don't, but we have some understanding of physiology such that we can bring people from the dead. There's scientists that are now trying to bring back the woolly mammoth that's been dead for tens of thousands of years. They actually do talk about how we're knowing enough about their genome that we can use the genome of elephants and bring back the woolly mammoth. So it's the idea of not setting aside the laws of nature, but having a greater understanding of the laws of nature.
that's a beautiful answer. And I endorse all of those things. Claudia would say, yeah, those are human capacities. I would say, as a theist, this movement is lured by God and has something to do with the presence of the Spirit, that we have these capacities, that my son is, as a person on the autism spectrum, is able to function. The drugs that keep many of us alive when we would otherwise be dead. To me, some maybe wouldn't reflect the will of God, like using chemical warfare on the citizens of Syria, for example. But others would seem to me to be part of the healing, presencing compassion of the divine spirit, enabling us to do these things as over the course of evolution. So I speak of it as a form of divine action, a form of divine presence, just not as physical miracle. So I don't know if that's a nuance of difference between you and me, Luke, or if that's actually what you yourself meant to affirm.
I'm going to go with the nuance.
Okay.
There's some differences, but I think we all have nuances.
Yeah.
So,
And
but
it's
now-
easier to talk to you guys than it was to Claudia,
yeah.
right? We were further away. We had to work harder at it, but we did find that the friendship encompassed it, and the willingness to listen to the other and to capture what they were saying could make sense. Because we live in a world where people listen and in order to find something idiotic and make fun of it, right? And if we could listen to each other, theist or atheist, Jew, Christian, Muslim, and in order to see how close can we get? how could I say back to her what I could actually affirm and thereby find common ground?
Right.
Mm.
I mean, it's easy for the three of us. Maybe it's easy with many of your listeners, but I think one of the calling of one who's called to love, to the values of Christianity, is to find that common ground in a world that seems to want to destroy everyone who is not
Yeah.
of the same
Right.
purpose.
So this brings us to the last chapter in your book, two different perspectives on one sacred story.
Mm.
Yeah.
There in that chapter, you're writing about two perspectives, but you've just talked about dozens of perspectives on one sacred story.
Yeah. That took maybe the most work because both of us wanted to stay true to our core convictions, but formulate our story in a way that um, could harmonize with what our co-author was writing. And you can, I hope, this is for you and readers to judge, that there's a sense of a common spirit between the two. And yet there are clear differences. And the more people read and know theology and humanism and so forth, the more they can recognize, no, they didn't agree in the end. This was not a book that made humanism and theism equal.
Mm.
They're telling different stories, but they're so interestingly in parallel that there's something exciting about that outcome.
Right.
How, given her kind of existential situation during this time, how did that factor into her
That's a
thinking? And
great question. That's a great question. Because at least my very early, very conservative evangelical self would say, oh yeah, humanists, they're fine when things are going well, but when they get to the hard points, it sort of collapses into rosy language.
right.
And I just have to say, watching Claudia, as I watched my mother, for example, who was not a theist, die, that way of seeing the world can accompany one through their final illness and their dying process and bring comfort. And I think I will live and die as a theist, and it's a slightly different story, but I cannot take away from people like Claudia or my mother or many others that you guys know the fact that they have a view of the world that brings value and comfort, orientation, meaning to their lives, and it isn't so far from where I
Mm.
sit.
Right. Wow.
All right. So, Philip, that's our whirlwind tour through your book, which is a great book. I highly recommend it. But anything that we didn't talk about that you wish we had?
Yes, my final word is just to step out of this conversation and look at the dynamic of this conversation. As I've listened to many, many of your podcasts in the past, what is shared is a willingness to talk across difference. Second, what is shared is a willingness to stay with the Christian tradition, even though the version, you guys often use this language, the version that we knew as kids might not be the version we can affirm now. And the third is to not see theological debates as angels dancing on the head of a needle, otherworldly, abstract, metaphysical. They're very much about how we live in the world, how we greet a person of a different political party or race or religion, how we live compassion in the world, and most of all, how we care for a planet in crisis. And that's what I loved about this conversation is that it was clear that this is about how people actually live and not about vague, merely
Right.
conceptual arguments. That would be my sense.
Hmm.
Well, we're going to have links in our show notes to your webpage, your works, so that people can check you out. But maybe you can tell us, Phil, is there anything in the pipeline? Any projects, any books, appearances in the pipeline?
Yeah, lots of appearances, and I'll try to do a better job of keeping them up to date on my website. I'll be in India and Indonesia this year. I just came from the Homebrewed Christianity, you probably know, the Trip Fuller World, and they bring together 600 people once a year for
Beer camp.
kind of Christian, yeah, Christian fellowship in a sense. Um, but I mentioned Climate Change, What Must Be Done, which I think turned out to be really powerful book. 12 brilliant authors writing from the heart about what can be done, not it's hopeless, but what can be done. Steve Knapp and I have worked for years on a book called Hope Beyond Belief, and that's just finished. Hope Beyond Belief for a Fragmented World. And I think for people who struggle with some of the concrete beliefs, hope can still be a deeply Christian word which ties us over when the beliefs fail us, whether that is in environmental questions or life meaning questions or religious questions of ultimacy in God. So those are the ones I'd mention.
Okay, Philip, I really enjoyed this conversation. I'm looking forward to the next books and your next appearance on this podcast. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me, you guys.
It always goes too fast, but it was excellent, and hopefully will inspire our viewers to hit your website and check out. You've written so much; it's just astonishing.
Very cool. It's a great, to use a word we might have used in our youth, ministry.
Yeah.
In a funny way, we're reaching out to you guys are reaching a lot of people with a path forward where they might have thought there was none after evangelicalism.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, have a good one. Bye for now.
Be well. Take care.
See you later.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with your hosts, Luke Jansen and Scott Dyer. Send your comments and suggestions for new episodes to lukejjansen@gmail.com. Join our private discussion group on Facebook by searching for the Recovering Evangelicals podcast group. Look for the logo that you always see at your favorite podcast catcher and ask to be let in. Subscribe to lukejjansen.wordpress.com if you want to get advanced releases and group posts, or browse through our archive for a full listing of all our previous episodes. And please help the podcast by sharing with a friend and leaving a review at your favorite podcast catcher.